Hello, everyone. Hi. It's wonderful to have a Saturday afternoon lecture at Woodmere. This is the first one in a long time, Patricia. Oh my God! And it's wonderful to see so many friends. And some of you I don't know, but I hope you will be friends as well of Woodmere and this institution. My name is Bill Valerio. I'm the director of Woodmere, and I'm very excited to be here, surrounded by the exhibition Body Language, the Art of Larry Day. And I'm going to be introducing my good friend, Ruth Fine, who is going to be speaking with us today about Larry Day. And Ruth has a unique relationship to the artist insofar as Ruth has been the life partner, the wife of Larry Day, and is his widow, and is also a distinguished curator. Ruth, for many decades, served as curator at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. And so, insofar as, every exhibition is a journey, the journey of this exhibition has been together with Ruth. And, I think I can speak for every member of the staff here at Woodmere that, we all learned a lot working together with you, Ruth. You give very generously of your knowledge and ideas, and, you've been very kind and giving to all of us. So thank you, Ruth, very much. I think that this Ruth's spirit, resonates through all of the aspects of the exhibition, and that's, not only the installation, but the catalog, which is very beautiful. And another person I want to acknowledge is Tessa Haas, who's sitting in the second row, and Tessa has been part of this journey as well. Tessa works together with Ruth as sort of a project coordinator for the exhibition, and it's been really wonderful to work with you as well, Tessa. So thank you. And with that, I just want to say thank you again to all of you for joining us today, and let's have a big round of welcome and applause, and let's give it up for Ruth Fine.
Now, is it working? Is it good enough? Okay. This is a three-part exhibition. The largest part and most comprehensive part is here at Woodmere, with an introductory gallery that you would have walked through up the steps to get here, that introduces the abstract work, the work that's specific to place, and the work that is figure compositions, which is what is here. And importantly, the works on paper, which are both out there and surrounding on the balcony. And there's so many people here who knew Larry, and what I've discovered, I met Larry when I was 19. We didn't get married till I was 42, but we knew each other well in the interim. But a lot of you knew him well also, in different ways. And the most interesting thing for me has been to realize how much I've learned during the course of doing the exhibition, that things I thought were true are not true, and some of you in the audience have straightened me out. So if anybody has a comment to make or a question to ask, we were going to hold that for the end when a mic could be passed around, but I think it would make more sense if you just raise your hand and say or ask whatever you want to say as we're going on through the time I'll be talking, and I better make a plan to save time at the end for questions. So anyway, and if somebody asks a question, I'll repeat it so everyone can hear it. The talk is basically intended to integrate the three sections. It's not particularly chronological, and it's not specific to the individual three places. It's intended to give a sense of all three exhibitions, and also to give a sense of Larry as a person who essentially was totally devoted to his art. There's a long list of people that need to be thanked, in particular for organizing this program today. I would thank Hildy Toe, who's the head of education, and Rick Ortwine, who is the head of installation and all things technical, and Rachel Herskowitz, who is the curator here, who would have would have given Hildy the images that were needed. I'm not going to give a long list of the people other places that, but at the University of the Arts, the director, Sid Sachs, and at Arcadia Exhibitions, the director, Richard Torchia, were the two people most specifically involved. The painting that you're looking at is called Tree in the City. It's a space around Delancey Street. When Larry was in Washington living, or in Tacoma Park, which is where we lived, he moved there around 1985 and continued to teach here until 1988, when he left University of the Arts, where he had taught for 35 years. And this is a space near the home of Jane and Digby Baltzell, who were good friends of his, with whom he stayed when he was in Philadelphia. And the painting originally belonged to the great literary critic Harold Bloom, who became a good friend of Larry's. And when Harold died, the painting was actually given to a friend of his, but the person who owns it wanted it to be credited to Harold Bloom, and so that's who is being credited here. And it's on view at as a centerpiece, really, of the exhibition at Arcadia. Larry did do some figurative work before he became an abstract painter, but the first work that was best known in the city was were his abstract expressionist paintings. And many of them have a feel of landscape. I would say the people who he was most akin to during this period were de Kooning in some ways, and later Guston in some ways, although his closest friend during this period was Franz Klein, who did teach at the University of the Arts for a few years in the early 50s, and with whom Larry stayed in touch till Klein died. And then I stayed in touch with the woman who was Klein's partner at the end of his life. It seems to me to be the perfect photograph on the left of an abstract expressionist painter, sort of proud of what he'd done in the studio, something on the easel, something surrounding him. Slight smile, but not a full smile. As those of you who knew Larry, he was a quiet man with a lot to say, but he only said what needed to be said when he felt it was appropriate to say it. And the same thing is very true, I think, of the work that he did. The whole notion of unfinished comes up in relation to Larry's work, and it's because there are empty areas, there are things that are very clearly and heavily completed. Not heavily, he never painted heavily. Even these abstract paintings are not thickly painted, as you can see from the one that's outside here, which is this painting that I'm showing you here. So you can see some of the works that I'm showing you in slides, and I assure you they're much more beautiful when you actually see the real thing. Larry was born in Philadelphia, and at the age of 12 he moved to Cheltenham Township, and he lived in the same house for the rest of his life. moving to Tacoma Park when I lived here, and the outside of that house is the painting that is second one in on that wall. That's the outside of Larry's home on Myrtle Avenue, which, as you can see, does have many unfinished spots. The photograph on the left is of Larry as a little boy, and the painting on the right is one that he did around 1991 when he was doing the self-portrait that's over there, Day by Day, Larry Day by Larry Day. And you can get a sense of how he used photography in these two comparative images. He used photography throughout his life, sometimes photographs he took, sometimes photographs people sent him, sometimes photographs from magazines or journals. I think less from books. I used to think it was important to keep his whole library, and then I found thousands of images that were cut from various places, not from books. He wasn't destroying books, that I think were the real source of his work. So I felt less horrible getting rid of his library. He was in a working class family. He did the commercial course. He was always very proud that he was the first person who borrowed from the Cheltenham Library the second volume of the biography of Keats, that nobody had borrowed the second volume before him. So he was always an intellectual, always studying deeply, but in some ways trying to hide it so that he wouldn't be outside of his sphere. He was in the Pacific Campaign, was there when the flag was waved at Iwo Jima, became the librarian at Iwo Jima, was almost killed twice, once when a kamikaze pilot hit the boat next to his, and once when he was in a foxhole with a piece of metal in front of him, and shrapnel went into the foxhole, and if the metal hadn't been there, he'd have been dead. I think this had a profound impact on the rest of his life, as it did for everybody I know who served in that war, or I guess any other war. But the thing that came out of it that was positive was his ability to go to college. And he originally was going to go to Kenyon College, where he was accepted, and he wanted to become a poet. He wanted to become a writer. He wanted to go to Kenyon to study with John Crowe Ransom. And a friend of his who was going to Tyler basically said, why don't you come to Tyler while you're waiting to go to Ohio? And so he went to Tyler, and he found himself extremely at home at Tyler. He loved it. He loved the fact that he could study not only painting but also writing, theater, composition, criminology, a whole range of subjects. But what he talked about over the years to me was how he felt at home there, and it was the first time he really felt at home. He felt he was in a community of people who cared about what he cared about. And so he decided to stay there, and he never went to Kenyon. And he spent the first 2 years of his time there trying to determine whether he should be a writer or a painter. And what's on the right here is the cover of the Temple Owl, in which there's an essay called The Lion that is published in the catalog. The catalog for the exhibition has five pieces of writing by Larry. And one of the things I learned, I always knew writing was important to him, but one of the things I learned in organizing this show, I think, is that the writing was really as important to him in many ways as his painting. And so the next project is to do an edited volume of the writings, of which I have 2 file cartons. some of it published, some of it not published, but he did publish throughout his life, and both painters and writers came to him to publish what he had written. This video here, if you haven't seen it either here or it's on one of the messages that Woodmere has sent out, has Larry talking about his own work in a way that I think is quite lovely. He loved acting. He was very active at the Cheltenham Art Center and at Tyler, and the photo on the left is Larry in Tiger's Gates. And I think acting, in a way, gave him a stage for being dramatic and loud. And he didn't continue to act on the stage in any case for the rest of his life. This pretty much stopped early on, but it was very important to him, as was the Cheltenham Art Center. He was president of the board at a certain period. And so one of the things that became clear to me, again, during this process was what a community-oriented person he was in every aspect of his life. I always thought of it as being rooted in his teaching, but it clearly was rooted in more than that. And another really important element of his work, which seems to me to be very important in terms of what artists are doing today, is the self-reflective aspect of his work. And so self-portraiture, while it can be seen in the paintings and in the drawings that came later, it certainly was important early on. The reason there are so many circa dates on the works and titles in parentheses is because Larry didn't date almost anything. Some things I have figured out that I feel comfortable with, some things I'm less comfortable with, some things I figured out in relation to other things. He also didn't necessarily give titles. He also didn't necessarily sign things. There are things that I know he exhibited, and yet they're not signed on the front or the back. So that seemed interesting to me. Changes, which is, where is Changes? Here, right here, exactly, is a wonderful example, both of his self-portraiture, not both, of his self-portraiture, of his commitment to teaching. The young woman standing behind him was one of his students. We have an Italian Mannerist painting to the left and a Northern Mannerist painting to the right. His Italian roots were very important to him. He was born Lorenzo del Giorno, although he was baptized Lawrence James Day. He went as Larry Day for many years. Sometimes he spelled Lawrence Laurence, sometimes he spelled it Lawrence. He was not somebody who wanted things to, in a way, be tightly woven. He wanted always for there to be some sense of movement, and it seems to come across in all of these different parts of his life. He actually had to legally change his name to Larry Day when we moved to Maryland, because he could not get a driver's license that said Larry Day unless he had changed his name from the name on his birth certificate, which was Lorenzo del Giorno. And if he was to get a Maryland driver's license at that particular moment, it would have to be as Lorenzo del Giorno, and a name which he had never used in his life except for one set of drawings that he did, which is now at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. The table that's on the front right of the painting as I'm looking at it, so I guess left of the painting as you're looking at it, is a painting that I still have. The boxes and objects that are at the bottom, he was always looking at objects for one reason or another, and if you look at the paintings that we'll see throughout and the drawings that we'll see throughout, you will just see things that were of the world, things he owned, things he invented. To stay with the self-portraiture a little bit and to return to the watercolor you saw earlier, this is day by day. You can see in here the importance of geometry to all he was working with and on, his structuring with geometry. Most of the paintings of figure compositions are accompanied by many, many drawings. The one on the right is owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who, because of COVID, wasn't willing to lend to the exhibition, so the one that's on the wall, along with the watercolor and the painting, is one that I own. But I've recently given, I think, maybe 20 drawings, some of them highly finished drawings, and many of them small sketches that Larry used to develop that painting. But he also, some of them preceded the painting, some of them were done while he was working the painting out, and some of them, I think, were his reflections back on the painting. So that I tend to use the phrase when thinking about drawings related to rather than study for, because you don't really know when an artist did the drawings. Those of you who've seen the John show either here or in New York would realize that many of his drawings, more often than not, his drawings and prints come after his paintings, not before his paintings. So that's commonplace. But you can just see the differences that the far left of the painting doesn't have that bank of windows that's on, well, as I'm looking, yeah, my far left, your far left, I guess, too. The bank of windows varies. The most interesting, or one of the more interesting aspects of the painting is the space behind Day sitting at the easel. And it's impossible to know for certain whether that's meant to be a painting that is hanging on the wall or is meant to be a view outside a window. And it's this either or that is very, very important to his thinking about his work. Both and, this and that, not this or that. Just to go back a little bit, these are early representational works. The one on the left is, the image on the left is a painting, on the right is a print. There's a gallery of prints at Arcadia, because Arcadia has always been known for its printmaking program. Benton Spruance founded the program, and for many years you could get a BFA degree at what was then Beaver College, where I taught for a little while in the 60s. And at the time, as far as I knew, Beaver was the only place where you could get a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from a small liberal arts college in the country. So its art program was always very important, and printmaking was always very important to its art program. I learned this week that they no longer teach lithography there. So they only taught lithography before I taught there. Benton Spruance only taught lithography. I set up the etching program and the screen printing program. So the big changes that are happening now have always been happening in one way or another. You can see that the print is in reverse of the painting, and it was drawn on the stone in the same orientation as the painting. But then when the image came out, it printed in reverse. And Larry had a show in New York called Nudes and Angels in 1954. And it's likely that one or both of these might have been in that show. And the same here. On the left is a drawing, Sacred and Profane. The two images on the right are lithographs. And what seemed to me very interesting is the one on the bottom is the second state. And so in working that lithographic image, he was eliminating, he wasn't adding, he was taking away all of those dark areas. And so that sense of taking away was important to him in his work in the 1950s, as it remained important to him always. This is called To Pergamum. It's a painting that is at Arcadia. And I want to read some things that Larry said about it. It was just recently given to Woodmere by Natalie Charco-Hollander, who was one of Larry's best friends. She and her family from the 1940s on, really. But I want to read, the notion of writing, this is a pamphlet that was in the April 1958, Search and Research is the title of the pamphlet, and it's the Art Education Bulletin of the Eastern Arts Association. And he says, I'm starting a figure composition. And I mean, the reproduction of it, just so you know, is, well, it's in here somewhere. It's here. So this is what the main subject of this article is, or he's leading up to that. I'm starting a figure composition. There is in my mind a vague idea of the painted figures in a type of space. Now I start the mind conditioning. And that notion of the mind conditioning is really critical. I look at 100 figure compositions. Later, I suppose I will look at single figures. I study Bellini, Titian, Michelangelo, Cézanne, Rubens, Poussin. I haven't located a similar idea yet. I'm reading de Tolnay's Medici Chapel, Sitwell's Noble Essences, René Char, have been thinking about D.H. Lawrence, Hölderlin, Goya, in music, about Stravinsky, Gluck, and modern French music. So very, very important to the way he was thinking in 1958. That was all important to the way he was thinking for the rest of his life. He starts by saying, and then he goes on, I'm just skipping around. The white canvas 4x5 is beautiful. One can become hypnotized with its purity and limitless evocations. It will be necessary to dirty it soon, just to dirty it. Purity is the greatest and most terrible enemy of art, which I found fascinating. I'm not going to read you anymore, but it's just amazing to me how critical that was that early in his career. And as I say, the painting, this is its final state in Woodmere, and I have always, up until now, really thought about the after Jan Steen painting from 1962 that as being the only figure painting after a painting. He would do endless drawings, but I think this really comes before it. It's after sculpture, not a painting. But the idea was that he was thinking about going back to figuration as early as 1958, which is critical. Drawing was always central to Larry's work. These are both upstairs after Veronese. No, actually they're at UArts. The one on the left is at UArts, and the one on the right is upstairs. And he did a whole range of and he used a whole range of materials. He would, and combinations of materials. And he's really always looking carefully. But issues of chance, I do want to read one more thing here. In the process of doing the show, one of the things that Tessa Haas did was something like 30 oral histories with people who knew Larry. And one of them was with the artist Cynthia Carlson, who taught at PCA with him. And she and Larry were as far apart in their thinking about their work as any two people could be. But she went on at great length about how important Larry was to her because of his desire to have a conversation, to talk about art, to think about art. And it didn't matter whether it was art he liked, art he felt close to, all irrelevant. And she speaks about how she had invited John Cage to speak at a PCA, and she knew Larry really wasn't a great fan of John Cage because Larry didn't start with Chance. Chance came in later. But she said he knew more about John Cage than anybody else in the school, that he was the one who could argue with John Cage, could discuss John Cage, could champion John Cage if he wanted to, because it didn't matter whether he cared or didn't care. But one line in here, which I think is wonderful, in talking about to Pergamum, or just the idea of working, the fragmentary form becomes symbolic of the stress of flux. The heightened moment is never the planned moment. Form must always come upon me unawares. So that the issue of chance was very important. It's just, when did the chance come in? It didn't start with chance, it moved forward with chance. So this is the stain painting that now belongs to Woodmere, and a drawing that it still belongs to Natalie Charcot of Stain. And he was very, very interested in this period of Dutch painting because of its connection to the everyday. For him, the ordinary was the extraordinary. And so the quotidian experience was what he cared most about. And when he became more involved with representation, as you can see throughout the show, excuse me 1 minute. Games became critical, and one of his first subjects was the bridge game, and in the left you see the bridge game with references to conceptual issues and to Duchamp, who of course was everybody's idol. I would say in the 60s we were all thinking about Duchamp, and Larry was on a panel with Duchamp at the Philadelphia College of Art later in the decade. But what's interesting to me is there are several drawings of the bridge game, but the one on the right seems so abstract, and while he never, once he did that stain painting after stain painting, he never went back to abstraction. Issues of abstraction have remained in his work through the rest of his life, and I feel like this bridge game is on the right is really kind of pushing back in abstraction in ways that other things didn't. The games, which is behind us, is very strong evidence, as are the watercolors that are in the introductory gallery, of Larry's commitment to issues of pop art and popular culture. There is a Monsanto ad next to the painting on the wall that depicts the most of the figures in the main Twister composition. The woman at the right is clearly a Vogue model, and I'm not positive what the two above are. They may be Vogue models as well, or they may be from porno magazines, which were found in his library as well, just because of his interest throughout the life of the nude. And then the on the right is a watercolor related to it, but it's fascinating, and Bill Valerio found that Monsanto ad after the catalog went to press, so that's not in, at least so far as I know, among the papers that I have of Larry. The cover of the catalog is this narrative to the memory of Matteo Giovannetti, a Sienese painter, a very little known Sienese painter, who Larry became interested in, but also is, I think, a splendid example of the issues of pop art. He was very involved with Italian movies. And one of the two things that became clear in working on the show, this group of these three figures appear in one of the late drawings up here, I think the third from the end. So this is 1967. These are 1997. And so 30 years later, these figures reappear, which happens frequently. The figure in the middle also appears in other places in the work. But again, he uses less paint to get more luscious surfaces than any painter I know. I think early on that may have simply been because he couldn't afford the paint, but by the time he was doing this, he had a perfectly good job and used very good materials, and you could have used as much as he wanted, but he was taking off. He was not being expressionistic in this kind of thickly painted work, but making as much. He was interested in fresco painting, and he was interested in, tapestries. the painting charade, the game of charade, there's a drawing above it on the balcony that does not have the figure of Larry. The figure of Larry is one of the ways he worked. If friends came to his studio, he would say, will you take my picture doing this? I would need it for a painting. And he would also say to his friends, will you pose like this? I need a pose like that for a painting. But again, this figure, with the arms outstretched, it appears in one of the watercolors. So they date from about the same period. So he's using the same image in totally different ways for totally different reasons in the same work. And the poker game is well known at Woodmere. It was the painting that first turned Bill Valerio onto Larry's work, and there were many, many drawings for it. And there was an exhibition based on it. The painters are to the left, Armand Mednick, who recently died, a ceramist, Dennis Leon, who was the head of sculpture at PCA and then became the head of sculpture at CCAC, David Pease, who went from Philadelphia to be the head of the painting or the art department at Yale, and the person in the orange, or in the yellow sweatshirt, is Jimmy Luders, who went to and taught at the Academy for many years. So this was a group, we have the painting called The Group. It's not exactly the mirror of the same people, but some of the same people are appearing in all of them, and then the related drawings. I'm taking too long. I'm going to move very quickly. The painting, The Group, is a group of artists in Philadelphia, the everyday people in Larry's studio. Again, we have Leonard Lehrer, Dennis Leon, Monica Vitti. Monica Vitti was someone we all idolized in the 70s, in the 60s. Joan Leon, Larry sitting at the middle, Sidney Goodman, me sitting on the floor, David and Julie Pease, Eileen Goodman, their daughter Amanda, and Daniel Goldman, who is the son of a woman named Doris Gray, who lives in Philadelphia now, and Stuart Goldman, who lives in Cincinnati. This is a recent addition to the Woodmere collection. Mrs. Myers, Gladys Myers, ran Gallery 1015, which was one of the critical galleries at that moment in Philadelphia, about which much more needs to be learned. And this is one of the paintings that, it's over here. It's probably more equally figure and landscape. I have a few landscapes to show you, or architectural scenes, but this really balances the two, and there's that wonderful dog on the bottom looking one direction and the person above him looking the other direction, and issues of structure. Larry always was totally confirmed, committed to issues of structure in the work. This is here, the one on the right, and the one on the left is called Suburban Landscape, and it's like the painting behind, the partial portrait on the right, which is me. And I didn't know for many years who owned it. It was fascinating to kind of see it again. But there are not many suburban pictures of this store. There's much more, Larry was much more involved with construction scenes like this that belongs to the Academy. And the two drawings are called Study for Construction Site, which is probably how I gave them to them, but seeing them in the show, I'm quite convinced they were done after the construction. This painting was done. Larry would never have stayed. He would never have done two drawings that were that absolutely close, even in different media, even though there is the, the addition of this is neither in the painting or the drawing, but that's not major enough for me to think that was a study for. I think they're all studies after. At Arcadia, there's a beautiful gallery of scenes, and they were often just the scenes near him. The one on the right is a church that was at the corner of that Myrtle Avenue house, and the one on the left is Curtis Arboretum. And so there's a range of drawings, watercolors, of subjects, of dates, and of media at Arcadia. And Larry was a beloved teacher. What everybody, all of the students who were on the videos that Tessa did, the oral histories, talk about how Larry taught them to think. And I think that's absolutely true. He certainly taught me to think when I was a student and met him. And what Cynthia Carlson said about, how much he knew about someone he really didn't appreciate. There are very few paintings of the nude, but there are many, many, many drawings of the nude figure, as we see here. And this was called Harry's class. It was a class of somebody named Harry Soviak, who, as it turned out, he was the first person I knew who died of AIDS when we didn't even know what AIDS was. But that was a PCA class. The standing model at the right was Eddie Poole. Anybody who went to school during the 60s, 70s, 80s would have encountered Eddie Poole. Larry's studio filled with books, with reproductions, with a sculpture by Natalie Charco. I think a Greek pot that's in that cabinet over there, which is filled with just an array of things that belong to Larry. And the writings that are in the catalog are, one piece is referred to Poussin, one piece is referring to Matisse, and they use what Larry said about Matisse painting Madame Matisse and how Matisse wanted her to pose 100 times. I did not pose for 100 times, I assure you, but these are here really to reference his writing, and then his late drawings, which when I go back to that surreal story of the lion that was in that Temple publication in the 40s, I mean, essentially, the writer is trapped in a hotel room with a lion next door. I mean, how surreal is that? And the late drawings of Larry's through the 90s, he did much more drawing than painting through the 90s. He was quite sick. I mean, Larry had cancer from 8 months after we got married, and he was never really without cancer. So what he did had some, in the 90s he was drawing more than painting. But you see, residences and factories and mountains and, strange people, strange objects. I don't recognize music. This has some relationship to the base of the other civilization that's out in the Venus Society drawings that are in the front. The one, firm series, or one firm series is up on the balcony. Another firm series is at Hollins College in Roanoke, Virginia. But there are many individual drawings, and they're very, very strange. And they're all pen and ink. They have no underdrawing in pencil. There is no pre-planning. As far as I ever knew, they evolved as they evolved. There's an imagination there that seems so much in keeping with the imagination we need to have today to cope with what we all have to cope with today. So I'm going to stop talking, and I hope you will have some comments or questions. I know Hildy has a microphone she's happy to bring to anybody who wants to ask a question, so the questions can be recorded as well as the answers. And if anybody knows the answer and I don't, please give the answer, because that's certainly apt to be true.
Hi, Ruth. This is a more personal question. I know Larry loved travel and being in Europe. Did you ever get a chance to go together?
Yeah, I don't know how much Larry loved travel. I don't know when you knew him, but any travel we ever did, I inspired, anywhere. We did go to Europe. We went to Europe to see the Poussin Seven Sacraments exhibition in Edinburgh in, I think it was 1980. And we went to see the the Matisse exhibition in 1971. Larry, Jane Piper, and I went to see the Matisse exhibition in 1971. Other than that, our travel was in this country. He never suggested it. He was happy to go. Once I got the train ticket and made the plans and everything else. So I'd love to know, why do you think he loved travel in Europe? He did lead a tour there. He led a tour at Positano in 1957, the date of which was supplied by Peter Payon, who was on that tour. I always thought it was 58. And he always, all the time I knew him, he talked about his year in Europe in 1952. And then I looked at his passport. There was never a year in Europe. It was about 3 months in Europe, maybe 4, according to the dates in the passport.
I guess I'm misinformed then, but just from reading the book, how, the time that he was in Europe, and he loved looking at the old masters, he really studied them, he was, a student of both art and literature, and, he harkens back to all, so many other painters of ancient times. So I just see him kind of captured by the history there, and then I imagine that he probably really loved traveling, but he was more comfortable at home, is what I'm hearing.
He wanted to be in the studio. Yeah. He definitely wanted to be in the studio. I had something slip by my mind in relation to that. If I think of it, I'll come back to it.
Well, your comments add to the whole picture of him for us. Thank you.
It's adding for me. I mean, I can't tell you. I mean, when I saw that he wasn't in Europe for a year, I was absolutely stunned.
Hi, Ruth, and thank you for the talk and for the beautiful exhibition.
By the way, it needs to be clear, and I don't think I said this at the beginning, the curator of, excuse me, I just don't want to forget this, it's very important. The curator for this exhibition was a British art historian, David Bindman, who knew Larry well. And he came here and spent 5 days, and we did as much visiting as we could, and he was supposed to come back twice more, but because of COVID, he couldn't, and he, of course, was supposed to be speaking here today, and because of COVID, he isn't. So I don't take any responsibility for the exhibition. I was sending things back and forth to David to think about, to consider. He came up, people said, who came up with the titles? Absence, Presence, Silent Conversations, and Nature. I'm blanking. So, Nature Abstracted, yeah. So David Bindman is really the person that deserves credit. So please now answer.
Well, please tell David that the...
David Bindman will be here on January 22nd, should the world...
He's a brilliant speaker, and...
Well, please tell David that the cadence of the show is kind of perfect for the work itself, if that makes any sense. I'm really curious about being in the room with these paintings. You get a sense of how a lot of them, most of them, sort of teeter on the precipice of almost allegorical painting, even though these spaces actually exist in the world, but in their mise-en-scène in terms of how they're utilized in the paintings. And I'm curious about how he might have thought about that part of the historical DNA of this work.
Totally. One of the things he talks about in this video is how he's not a realist. He was in the early realist shows, but he was never a realist. He never wanted to be a realist. He talks about commenting on things rather than depicting things. He was totally involved with allegory, metaphor, and the sense of, I think that's why there were so many drawings from old masters, that he learned from how they viewed these things, and he then viewed them with them. He talked about himself as being a rear guard artist, not an avant-garde artist. And he wanted to be in the rear guard. And it's an interesting idea. It's something I've thought about often about the work of Ralston Crawford, who is often put at the end of precisionism. And the more I've looked at Crawford, for example, I think he's the beginning of minimalism, not the end of precisionism. And so Larry wanted to be the end. He didn't. He knew by his own reading and looking, and by being close to his students. I mean, Larry had every hot record. He knew more about the music scene of his moment because of his students. In terms of classical music, he would have every version of every opera, or every version of Haydn, or every version of Frank Sinatra songs, so that he could see the variations and see how meaning was shifted because of the performance aspect of it. And it's this sense of his mind at work that makes me very eager to, not immediately, but in the near future, take on the writings, because they will answer you again and again. They're repetitive and they need to be edited. But this is exactly what he talks about. He talks about the difference between a narrative and a tableau in terms of figure painting, and what that means and what it can mean. Never what it does mean. It's never what it does mean. It's always what it can mean. And I mean, I know from my own time as a student, and every student said this in one way or another, you would go to talk to Larry about your work. You would know what you should read, you know what you should listen to, you would know what you should look at, and you wouldn't have a clue what he thought. Not a clue. Because it didn't matter that you had a clue what he thought. He just wanted to push you. He did not want a groupie group of people who followed what he did or what he thought. And, I knew it from personal experience, but to hear it said again and again and again is fascinating.
I wanted to ask the allegory question again, because as you were talking, I'm looking at the image that's on the screen, the drawing called Factory. And, when
I gave its title. I mean, he didn't title it, so...
I see the factories, in the background, and so yeah, it's an untitled work with a descriptive factory, that we're using as title. But when I think of allegory, I think of it as a translation, from one thing to another. And in these late drawings where I think you pointed out, there are these broken elements along the bottom and this sense of the world. And I wonder if you can talk about, how does Larry bring the social world around him? He lived through the Vietnam War, he lived through the Civil Rights Movement, he lived through the Black Power Movement, he lived through, it was a momentous, stretch of time through which his mature work evolves. And I'm just wondering about this question of allegory, and how the world creeps in, or how you see it as, being present in the work.
Well, I think we have to start with World War II. And I think having lived through World War II, and from 1988 till the end of his life, he went to annual reunions of his World War II battalion. And he did not want me to go with him. I didn't go with him. He didn't want me. He said, "You'll be bored." I have pictures of them. But I said to him at one point, I said, all you talk about is World War II. And Bill Daley, God bless him, is 97, about 20 years ago, started having real issues because he was a prisoner of war in World War II. And so 20 years ago, World War II hit Bill Daley. And I know that from my friendship with him. I think when Larry started going to those reunions is the start of these drawings and the thinking of everything that was going on in the world. I think he was always conscious of it. I think he always believed in art as a vehicle for maintaining sanity, that by making art and looking at art, and certainly over the history of time, he would have felt that art saved the world again and again and again and again, and that's what he wanted it to do now. But I think the chaos was his thinking back on World War II and all it meant. I mean, he was in a pineapple field in Hawaii, I think, for 6 months. He was in the Army battery that led the Marines onto Iwo Jima. And that's when this work started, was when he started those reunions. But because he didn't want me to go with him, I never knew what he wanted that to be a separate part of his life. That was clear. And he didn't talk about, he didn't necessarily talk about the hideous aspects of World War II, although I told you about the 2 times he came close to death. He did talk about that. But he talked about making drawings for his bunkmates to send home to their girlfriends. He talked about writing letters for them to send home to their girlfriends. He talked about the amazing cadence of the Southerners as opposed to the uncolorful language of the Northerners. I think that's why he wanted to go study at Kenyon with John Crowe Ransom, was he felt he was going to learn more about that. But till the end of his life, I mean, even when he was dying, he just was curious. I mean, he really would not take whatever the most powerful of the drugs was. He wouldn't take, I'm blanking, the drug that would take away the pain, because he couldn't stand being unconscious. He wanted another drug that wouldn't make him, it wouldn't take the pain away as much, but it would leave him more conscious. And the curiosity, and the conversation. You know, he really did want to talk to people, but then there were times when we would be in New York and I would say, well, don't you want to visit so-and-so? And he would say no. And I could never understand why. It was someone he cared about a lot. Somebody's spouse died. Don't you want to write a letter? No, I'm not going to write a letter. I mean, strange. Never, you know. I'm hoping that by really editing all the writings, there will be some greater clarity will come. But, you know, that's a couple years away. It's a good couple years job, I'm sure. So I think that's the allegorical aspect, Bill. I think it's just the unending chaos of our world, all the issues on civil rights, on gay rights, on women's rights. I mean, if there ever was a non-sexist person, as far as I could tell, and from anyone who studied with him, there was no denial of the power of women. But PCA was interesting in that regard, too. I mean, I had a woman named Lisa Langley for ceramics as a freshman. I had Edna Andrade for design as a sophomore. Doris Staffel was there. Jane Piper was there. Other women were there. I once said to Edna, it's amazing. There were so many women at PCA when I was there. I didn't feel this issue of sexism. And she said, well, that's true, Ruth, but we didn't get paid the same. But as a student, I wouldn't know that. And so everyone seemed equal, but he was certainly aware of all the tension. I mean, I was involved in the 70s with that focus, Philadelphia focuses on women in the arts, which, you know, everyone was involved with. But I once called one of the women artists involved and said, well, I'm going to a focus meeting. Do you want to go with me? And she said, oh, no, I have to stay home and make lunch for so-and-so. So, you know, names shall remain unknown. But the conflicts of the time and the students. I mean, Larry really treated and thought of, not, I mean, it wasn't treated. Larry thought of his students as young professionals. And he talked to them the way he talked to his colleagues or his friends. He wanted to know what they were thinking about. So yeah, all these things were part of it, but I think the origin is World War II in a much, I mean, until I saw the film Saving Private Ryan and saw the first half hour of that film. Now that's, of course, the invasion of Normandy, but the endless fighting in the first half hour of that film, and Larry was dead when I saw it, let me know what he lived through. And I would say that was the first time I had any sense of what he lived through, but that's what these drawings are about, in my mind. If you have any other thoughts, if anyone has any thoughts, I would love them. Of course, I don't feel firm in saying that. Anyone else?
I have one more I can ask you, Ruth. And it's an aspect of Larry's work that I've come to know is there, but I'd love you to talk about his sense of humor, because, you know, I've spoken to some people who knew him who said, my God, he was the funniest man that I knew. And I wonder if he would talk about that aspect of him.
It was wry. I mean, he was the humor editor for his high school paper. He was the humor editor for various things. It was always a wry humor. It was never an overt humor. Yeah. He did adore laughing. That's Margot Dolan, and Margot and Peter Maxwell and Larry and I spent a lot of time together when everyone was alive. And it was lots and lots of laughter. A joke. He would love a joke. When he was playing games, he would scream the loudest. He would argue with the umpire the most. And this was just a wry thing, not because he thought the umpire was necessarily wrong, but all umpires are wrong if they go against you, so why not argue with this one? What do you think, Bill? I mean, you see it, so why don't you talk about it?
Oh, so, I mean, I see the sense of humor, you know, certainly in the Twister painting and in the translation of that crazy Monsanto ad into a serious painting, you know, the advertisement is if you use deodorant soap, you can play Twister and you won't have to be embarrassed by your body smells. I mean, and it says that very literally in the ad, and I can't imagine an artist who doesn't have a very deep sense of the irony of life kind of, you know, translating that, you know, that into a monumental painting. And then there are things like, you know, the smile on the figure of himself as a young boy, and he's kind of like laughing at himself a little bit there, like that it's a very serious painting, you know, a man, you know, looking back on his childhood, but he's kind of, you know, I think there's a smile to it. Or in, you know, a drawing like that, the factory drawing, that crazy figure with the 3 heads, like 3 horse heads or pig heads, or you know, I you know, from where I'm standing, I can't quite see. I think they're horses or dogs or something. But you know, that there's kind of a craziness to it that's very whimsical.
These drawings are amazing in that regard. Yeah, we need a mic over here.
Oh yeah.
What I was going to add, what you just said, is on the factory drawing to the far right. You look at the little details, there's a figure shaking a martini. Now, it's particularly something that I'm interested in, and I know Larry was interested in it, but when you look at the seriousness, so to speak, of figuring out the relationship of these drawings, and then there's somebody shaking a martini, you can see the extensive humor and the whimsy in the picture.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, martinis were very important. He did do a cooking course very seriously for a couple of years. He liked to cook. We have all the recipes. Anyone else? Well, thank you for coming. I really appreciate seeing everybody. And I'm happy to talk to anybody.
One more.
Oh, sorry.
I've known Ruth since high school, and I was present with Larry a couple of times. He wasn't in my life, but I did go to the memorial service that you had for Larry. And the thing that I felt was so profound, I think about it a lot. You spoke, others spoke, there was a quartet, and then you played a song that Larry wanted at his memorial service. And it was Edith Piaf singing Je ne regrette rien. And I thought, oh my God, to live a life and be able to say, that's the song you leave.
Yeah.
That's my memory of Larry.
Yeah, no regrets.
No regrets.
Yeah, no regrets. Yeah. Thanks. I didn't see you here. Oh, how is this?
Thank you, Ruth. That was wonderful. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank everybody. Thanks for the photograph, Rita.